Yep, somebody just said Victor's 20's out.
Victor's 20?
Mm-hmm.
I thought they weren't coming out with it this year.
Yeah.
Or no, that was the Toasted.
I was like, we interviewed them and they said they're coming out with another Victor's 20. See how much attention you pay, right?
I don't. About like Fred, he's like, "You're a whiskey pig?" Yep. Talk to you.
We hung out for like 3 hours, man.
I carried you back to your room.
This week's release was a bit delayed. I was traveling again for work, but this time to Hawaii, so I'm still recovering a bit from island time. This episode with Fred Minni has a lot of great gems, and we cover a lot of different bases. I have to say that I love Fred's opinionated demeanor because he doesn't have an alliance to a particular brand, so he can be very truthful about almost anything. You're going to enjoy this episode. Next week is the last week for making your pledges to be a part of our October giveaway. We're going to have multiple winners again, this time with choice between glassware and books, including the book we discuss on today's podcast. Make sure you support the show on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Bourbon Pursuit. On Tuesday, the 25th of October, we're going to be hosting the second Bourbon Community Roundtable on YouTube Live. Make sure you follow us on Twitter and Facebook, as well as Blake from Bourboner.com, Carrie from Suburbia.com, the fellows over at BreakingBourbon.com, and a possible surprise guest from Brian Hara of Sippin' Corn's Blogspot. The link to be a part of the live broadcast to ask your questions will be available soon on all these outlets, so please join in and be a part of the fun. Always find what you love at Total Wine & More. With so many great bottles to choose from at the lowest price, it's easy to find your favorite Cabernet or a new single-barrel bourbon to try with some help from one of their friendly guides. And with every bottle comes the confidence of knowing you just found something amazing. With the lowest prices for over 30 years, find what you love and love what you find only at Total Wine & More. Curbside pickup and delivery available in most areas. Visit TotalWine.com to learn more. Spirits not sold in Virginia and North Carolina. Drink responsibly and be 21.
Play Whiskey Wednesday, Round 11, the memory game. Until June 26, each week you can win one of our 12 incredible grand prizes. Select $2 at checkout. And if they match on drawing night, you'll win that bottle. Not a match? No worries. You still score a Weller 12-year. Every $5 ticket gives you 5 chances to win, including 4 weekly bonus prizes. Get your tickets now at give270.org. Charitable Gaming License ORG 0002703.
From their bar to yours, Chad and Sarah of the popular YouTube channel It's Bourbon Night bring you their favorite at-home old-fashioned mix with the new Elemental Elixir's Golden Hour Syrup. It's a custom-made syrup with notes of bold black tea, warm spices, and orange zest. All you need is your favorite whiskey and ice. No bitters needed. One bottle makes 16 drinks, so that's only $1 a cocktail before you add your own whiskey. They can also be enjoyed in other cocktails or spirits, mocktails, coffee, tea, and anything you can think of. It's crafted locally in Lexington, Kentucky, and you can get your bottle now at whiskeyambitions.com. Ed Bly and Rising Tide Spirits are back again with a new release of Old Stubborn Bourbon. And this release of Old Stubborn is a premium hand marriage of 10, 11, and 12-year cask strength, barely filtered pot still bourbon. It comes in at a staggering 123.8 proof, and the flavoring grain for this one, which the last one was wheated, but this time it's now rye. Rich, sweet, and bold with a long finish that's sure to be another eye-opener. You can order online at Sealbox or thebourbonconcierge.com, and you can even purchase in person at Revival Vintage Spirits, and even now with very few select stores in Kentucky. You can get it now while you can, but be sure to do it because it's not going to last long. Do you ever pour yourself a bourbon, swirl it around, and then start struggling to come up with tasting notes? And perhaps you're also looking for a good Father's Day gift idea. Well, you can now solve both with a kit from Knows Your Bourbon. And unlike other nosing kits on the market, Knows Your Bourbon kits feature real ingredients for the most authentic aromas. You can smell real Tahitian vanilla bean instead of some synthetic aroma that's just made from chemicals. So head on over to knowsyourbourbon.com and enter code BP10 for 10% off your order. Welcome back to the episode of the Bourbon Pursuit podcast.
Kenny and Ryan here today, and we are in Prospect, Kentucky, in a little well-known neighborhood called Norton Commons, talking to our guest in his office today. But before we kind of introduce him, I think we should introduce it with a story of how we actually, Ryan's actually known our guest for a while, but we actually have a pretty funny story on what we thought we were going to have in one of our first episodes.
Yeah, so I've known Fred for a few years, and when we talked about starting this show, I emailed Fred. I was like, "Hey, man, can we get you on the show? What can we do?" And you're like, "Hey, I'm actually going to this event at Churchill Downs with Harlan Wheatley at Buffalo Trace." And I was like, "Oh, sweet!" And you gave us tickets, and you're kind enough to do that. We show up, we're like scrabbling together to get like podcast staff and like microphones. We put a microphone right behind where Harlan and Fred were sitting, and we're like, "Man, this is gonna be golden! Great first episode." We get through the whole thing, and then I get the laptop, and I realize that we didn't hit record button, and it's like, fuck, what all that waste of time that, that was going to be our very first episode. So sort of appreciate you trying to get us started.
That was our, at the Kentucky Derby Museum, that was part of our Legend series, and that was a good night because Harlan revealed some juicy stuff.
Yeah, we had some good stag and some good, you were interviewing, and he revealed some good info there for sure.
One of my favorite things of that night was giving him shit about naming a vodka after himself.
I like that one for sure.
But
so you've heard his voice. Now let's introduce him. So today on the show we have Fred Minni. Fred is an acclaimed bourbon author and media pundit on all things bourbon. If you see him out, he's always dressed to the nines. He also happens to have today the Amazon #1 best-selling book in the whiskey category, Bourbon: The Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of American Whiskey. So Fred, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. That's it's a nice intro.
Yeah. Well,
Very
before we dive into the book and kind of talk about, life as an author and everything about that, kind of talk about your life before bourbon and before whiskey.
So I was, I'll give you the kind of the story of how I became a writer. I grew up in Oklahoma, and I showed pigs, and I was an FFA. I was real big into and that sort of thing, and we were winning a lot of awards. And my ag teacher,
you come to Louisville every year?
Actually, I did. I came to one year, and then we went to Indianapolis, and there used to be in Kansas City, so it was a little bit everywhere. But there was a time we were winning all these awards, and my ag teacher said, start writing articles about it. And I did. And I went to the fax machine, and I faxed my articles to the Oklahoma County newspaper, which no longer is in existence. And they ran the story on like page 4. And I saw my name on the newspaper, and I was hooked. And I've been writing since then. I was in the military and got sent to Iraq. I was an Army photographer. And when I came home in 2005, I moved to Louisville to be with the woman who's now my wife. And the only job I could get was as a food editor for a trade publication. And when you write about food, you eventually write about booze. And I went out on my own in 2006. And one of the first stories I wrote as a freelance journalist was about the Kentucky Bourbon Trail. That article appeared in Successful Meetings in the winter 2006-2007 issue. And in fact, I have actually never seen that issue. But I remember filing, and I got paid for it. But so that's kind of, it all started about 10 years ago. And at the time, there was not really anybody in Kentucky writing about it. It was just Mike Veach, giving talks, but no one was trying to bring a professional writer voice to it from Kentucky. You had Chuck Cowdery doing great work, but he was in Chicago. And you had Whiskey Advocate and Whiskey Magazine write about it, but they would be sending writers in from New York and from Scotland and from everywhere. And so I kind of made it my career goal was to like carve out this niche. And one of the first things I wanted to do was write a bourbon history. And publishers came back and said, no, and as an author, you're dictated to. You don't really have a lot of choices. And so I wrote Whiskey Women in between 2010 and 2013 when it came out. And Whiskey Women was the book that kind of put me on the map in a lot of respects because it gave women a voice who never had a voice before. And after that, I wanted to write a bourbon history. And people said, no, we want a tasting guide. And I really didn't want to write Bourbon Curious, because I was like, there's so many tasting guides out there, but they're like, no, believe me, this is going to do well. You want to do a tasting guide. And so I said, okay, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it my way, where I will disclose people's recipes and break things out kind of like sommeliers do by flavor profile. And they said, okay, we'll do that. And I'm glad I did that. I was a finalist for Tell's best, spirit book in the world. And
you got a lot of free bourbon out of it, probably.
Lots of free bourbon. And that's one of the perks of the job, right?
That we're stealing right now.
Well, actually, we have a real nice assortment up here. I wish folks could join us, but we got. Can I tell you what we're?
Yeah, sure. Tell the listeners what we're doing right now.
I'm tasting with these guys the Old Forester 1920 Four Roses limited edition single barrel. 2014, an Evan Williams barrel pick for the Icons of Whiskey, the Joseph Magnus straight bourbon that's finished in 3 different casks, the Bellamy 10-year-old sherry cask finish from Jack Rose, and what is actually my personal favorite on this table, the Russell's Reserve barrel pick from the packaged liquor store Lincoln Road in Mississippi.
So basically what he's saying is our afternoon's ruined.
Yeah. This happens sometimes when you write about bourbon. You're like, I'm just going to taste one thing. Some friends come over, and before you know it, it's 6 o'clock, and your wife's calling you, hey, when you going to come home?
So, you made Bourbon Curious a tasting book, and we've talked to a few of the people that have tasting books out there, and they had an idea when they were actually writing it that says we can't do many in a single day. So what was your process of going through to be able to say, I gotta be able to get through and make a tasting notebook, and I've got to do 50, 100, how many of bourbons? How am I going to do this? Because
I'm fortunate where I have a lot of experience in professional tasting. Going back to my days when I was a contributing editor for Tasting Panel magazine, which is a trade publication, I've been involved with, professional tastings for, close to 10 years. And there's a process. You taste and you spit. And it's basically that simple. And it's like you see it, and you see people do it on wine and everything. And, the obvious follow-up to that is, well, do you get the finish? And yes, you still get the finish. It's still on the tongue after you spit, and you don't have to actually swallow it all the way down to see if it's smooth necessarily. But when there are things in question, I will kind of set it off the side and taste it when I'm able to swallow. But when I'm at the San Francisco World Spirits Competition, we taste 1,500 spirits, and I have to.
How many days?
Over a 3-day period.
Holy shit.
And
does your palate get fatigued?
And each person doesn't do all 1,500 of them. The individual, you get about 200 when it's all said and done. But you taste, you spit, you taste, you spit. And my palate is kind of trained for it, but at the same time that is kind of like the Super Bowl of tasting in some respects. And I'm also a judge on the World Whiskey Awards, and we get quite a few, not as many, but when I'm tasting in my kind of confines where I'm doing the pouring and the tasting and all that, while I'm writing, I will try to do 3 a day. And usually you get a book deadline, and it's usually due in a year. So I would do 3 a day. And it's the same with like Whiskey Advocate. Like I have my deadlines pretty far out, and I know what I'm tasting pretty far out. So I try to do 3 a day. And sometimes you come up against the wall and you're like, crap, I got to get these in quicker, or I got to speed things up. Like for another book I'm writing, I mean, I've got 120 rums I have to taste in less than a month. So you just kind of you schedule it out. And you do the best you can to get in 3 a day, but there are times you have to crunch them in. But I know when my palate's gone, and I step away, and I won't score it. And there are some brands that are kind of like baselines for me that if I go back and I taste them and I think they're good, then I pull off. Then I was like, I can't taste anymore.
I got a question about writings. Like, what's kind of like your process of doing a book? Are you just like when that moment comes and you're like, I got an idea, let's go with it? Or do you have like I come here every day at the same time, crank out a few bad pages, see what works?
Every writer has his or her own methods. A lot of people are very disciplined and structured and have to be at a certain place at a certain time. I can write anywhere, and I think that comes from my time in the newsrooms, and it came from my time in Iraq when I had to write things for the Army. I can write anywhere, anytime. But what I have noticed is that when I do try to schedule it, I can't write for shit. So my best writing comes when I don't need to.
Right.
And also when I'm on deadline. Like if it's due like in a week or tomorrow, it's amazing how quickly I can write it. And I'm very fast. That's probably, as a writer, that's probably one of my greatest gifts, is that because I'm always thinking about what I need to write, I can just churn it out. As soon as I find my voice for whatever the book is or whatever this article is, it comes just off my fingertips pretty quickly.
Cool. So I want to go ahead and kind of switch gears and move to the book itself. So your latest book is Bourbon, The Rise and Fall and Rebirth of an American Whiskey. And I want to read everyone the first line of it so they have an idea of what they're in for. So bourbon is more American than apple pie, existed before baseball, has built more roads, schools, and government infrastructure than any other non-petroleum domestic product. And you finish off the thought with, bourbon is good for America, and it's time we understand the historic intricacies that make it so unique. So I want you to talk a little bit about your inspiration just behind writing the book in general.
Yeah, so going back to I've always wanted to do a bourbon history. And so now when I finally get the opportunity to write it, there's all these great books out there. Reed Mittenbuehler's Bourbon Empire was a beautiful book. Chuck Cowdery's Bourbon Straight, and then later Bourbon Strange, beautiful books. Mike Veach's Kentucky Bourbon, An American Heritage, beautiful book. And all these books really told wonderful histories, very accurate, very important in the bourbon narrative. And when you sit down to write something, obviously you have to write something that's different from what everyone else has done. Otherwise, why would anybody pick it up if it's the same thing as Chuck's or Mike's book?
And I think it's called plagiarism. That's kind of frowned upon.
Yeah. Plagiarism is...
I got away with it.
That's definitely frowned upon. But in general, the story has often been told, by through the distillers and showing them, and that's kind of been the format for bourbon books since really the 1960s. What I wanted to do was tell it through a legislative and regulatory perspective, and that first sentence kind of explains like it's important to America. And I basically went through congressional archives and Treasury testimonies and found all kinds of material that would show how important bourbon was from our country's history, and used a lot of public records to tell that story. Just an example. We hear a lot about the Whiskey Rebellion and everything that happened in the 1790s when George Washington imposed a excise tax on whiskey distillers. But in bourbon, I bring out the fact that when Thomas Jefferson repealed that whiskey tax in 1802, he was thought to be placating to the rich. And so distillers were in some respects considered the one percenters of 1802. And by repealing that tax, he was thought to be helping the rich and hurting the poor. And so that's just one little nugget. Also, I spent a lot of time on things like the Bottled and Bond Act, or kind of like how it came to be and the people who opposed it. People like Isaac Bernheim didn't want the Bottled and Bond Act to happen because they thought it was a way to thwart Canadian whiskey efforts that were growing in this country. During Prohibition, we all know that medicinal whiskey was served. I wanted to answer the question of how and why, and come to find out, bourbon distillers actually had to work really hard to make sure that medicinal whiskey was available. And part of the reason why was that was the only way that they could realize their investments. The rye distillers had made agreements with people in the Bahamas and Bermuda, and they sent their barrels of whiskey to those islands, which they would later be bootlegged into the States. The bourbon distillers tried to make similar agreements with Cuba, but Cuba wanted too much money per barrel. And so there, as Prohibition loomed, they were kind of stuck with all these barrels of whiskey. And so they lobbied for medicinal whiskey. But when Prohibition begins, there's not really much of knowledge of how it's going to be done. So on the very first day of, first week of Prohibition, distillers are getting arrested because they're trying to pull out whiskey in their warehouses to put in the medicinal market. And, distillers would get robbed. The doctors of the time would be constantly requesting whiskey, and they couldn't get it, so they would buy it from the bootlegger. And to put this into perspective, this was during the time after Spanish influenza. So whiskey was one of the only treatments for that. And this was before, penicillin and, the antibiotics we have today. And so whiskey was the choice medication for something that could kill you. And you had all these states trying to get medicinal whiskey, but not all of them would allow it. West Virginia and Indiana were both bone dry states, and they'd have these politicians trying to lobby for having medicinal whiskey, and they would make up these colorful stories about how their aunt was saved in Illinois with a pint of whiskey, and it was a very colorful time. But it was also a very serious time. And then after Prohibition, World War II hits, and the bourbon distillers are making industrial alcohol. The bourbon industry has been very proud of this statement, and I've always been kind of interested in it. What I learned was that they made it, but it was kind of begrudgingly. They were forced to in many ways. And the distillers were also, the larger ones were buying up the little guys. And so between like 1939 and 1955, we saw a lot of independents get gobbled up by Shenley, Seagram, and on the cooperage side, Brown-Forman was buying up the cooperages. So it was a very interesting time that would put them in Congress under investigation by the Department of Justice. So there's a lot of kind of drama unfolding in our political system, all just circling around bourbon. And that's what really a lot of the book is about. And I also studied the trends of the times and why bourbon came to be so popular and why it started to take a nosedive.
Is it more popular now or back then?
I would say in the 1950s, we probably had a little bit more popularity because it was not as there was not as much competition. The U.S. government didn't even have a definition for vodka until the late 50s. They called it grain neutral spirit, and when vodka and gin and the rum start taking hold, and then Scotch starts coming in here more, it became much more popular. I think it was much more popular just because there wasn't as much competition. But with that said, the bourbon distillers also knew that they had issues on the time. They were trying to fight for exports, and a big reason why bourbon is a unique product of the United States from the 1964 Congressional Declaration is because they were wanting to export to England and to Brazil and everywhere. While they were getting penalized by those respective countries, Scotch was allowed to basically go into places tariff-free. And so when they became a unique product of the United States, that opened some doors.
So I want to talk a little bit more about some of the chapters in the book, right? Because, I don't want to give anything away to the readers, but, there's definitely a lot of things that you can read just through Amazon and stuff like that. And I'd encourage everybody to just go out, also buy the book, but, kind of get a taste for what's in there as well. So I want to just say the title for a few chapters, and I'll just kind of give you one and kind of give the listeners like a sentence or maybe a minute or two of just maybe what they could expect. And the first one I thought was real good. I I read the first chapter on Amazon, the whole entire thing, and it's called The Father of Bourbon. And I thought it was really unique in there how you talked about a regrettable story you had when you were in New Orleans.
Oh, that was actually in Savannah.
Oh, Savannah. That's
Georgia.
Right.
So I was at this spot called the Alligator Soul in Savannah, Georgia, which has a really nice bourbon selection. And this really sweet woman says, I'm related to the creator of bourbon. And I said, oh, who's that? And
Is your last name Craig?
She said Elijah Craig. Her name was Maureen Craig. And you could just see the color drop in her face and her body posture change. I mean, my words actually, it crushed her. And I felt so bad for that. And it was a very regrettable moment in how I kind of handled that. Because, people say things to me all the time, and I don't always say things back when I know they're wrong. And I shouldn't have said that. But that moment kind of piqued my curiosity as to who should really be called the father of bourbon. And in Bourbon Curious, I say we probably never will definitively know, and I still don't think we will definitively know. But in this section, I give people who've been credited with being called the father of bourbon. And there's one guy named Jacob Spears who's kind of been lost. He's been lost. There's not a brand named after him. There's not a distillery.
Probably will be now.
Yeah, actually, the trademarks have been purchased. I saw, but he's a guy who has always been a known distiller. We know he was a distiller at least in 1790, but what we did not know was that he was actually distilling in the same area as Elijah Craig was allegedly distilling. And he's always been the guy that people point toward as like giving it the name of bourbon. So I put a lot of, I kind of did a little bit of, as I would with any research paper or whatever, I made some conclusions. Now, it is not a smoking gun or any definitive answer that says he is there's not a piece of paper I have that says I invented bourbon.
We crown you as king.
Yeah, nothing like that. And technically, the new charred oak thing that we give bourbon doesn't really come out as a regulation until the 1930s. So you could have just been making corn whiskey in the 1700s and call it bourbon. But
so was Elijah Craig real, or is he just?
Oh, Elijah Craig was real, and he was a distiller. He was more of kind of like a businessman. So he did a lot of different things. What hurts Elijah Craig is not anything about him. It's the people in the 1950s and their effort to get bourbon to be a unique product to the United States. They created these legends about him. And one of the legends that they created was that he invented bourbon through an accident of a barn fire. And it was specifically the barn catches fire and the barrels char on the inside. Now, I am not a forensic fire
How's that happen?
Person. But how does the inside of a barrel get charred on the outside? But I have figured it out, Ryan. It's the immaculate charception.
He was a preacher.
He was. He was a Baptist
really a preacher?
No, he's a Baptist preacher.
Okay.
He actually was. He was loathed and loved as a Baptist preacher. But he was. He's in the 1800s, in the late 1800s. A guy writes a book on the history of Kentucky and says the first bourbon whiskey was made at the fueling mill in Georgetown, and he owned it. So sometime later, people put two and two together and said he created the first drops of bourbon. And indeed, he did have a distillery, but we don't have anything more than that. What really hurts all of this is the kind of like county rivalries we have in Kentucky. Scott County, Nelson County, Jefferson County. In the 1800s, they were very much trying to stake their claim on everything that they possibly could. Even today, Kentuckians refer to themselves from the county, not from their hometown.
Or where'd you go to school?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, they're
the high school. It's the high school.
It's the high school.
Yeah.
I think that's specific to Louisville.
It might be.
But you get out in the country and It's very different.
I mean, I might be a little biased, but I think everything from Bardstown is a little bit better. No, just kidding.
But so that's that's a little bit of that story of the father of bourbon. I think if you read that, you're going to get a much better picture of who was doing what, and some of the distillers that really mattered. And you're also going to see some really mainstream names like Abraham Lincoln and Daniel Boone. So you have a lot of people, from our American history in there.
Never heard of the guys. No idea. I'm just kidding.
Abraham Lincoln.
So the next few chapters in the book, it talks about going through we kind of touched it on already, government, friend and foe, going through prohibition, big business after prohibition. And then another chapter is chapter 8, the boom of the bourbon image. Mm-hmm. Now, is this relating to the marketing side of the house of all the things that came out in regard to then of blends trying to rule the world?
That was really a time when an organization called the Bourbon Institute put their heart and soul in connecting America and bourbon as much as possible. They are the ones who created the Elijah Craig backstory. To add to that backstory, they said that he invented bourbon on April 30th, 1789.
The specific date.
The same day that George Washington was sworn into office. And so in the book, I said the only way they could have made it sound more American for the time was that, if it beat up a KGB operative or something like that.
Chug some Budweiser.
Yeah, it was a PR effort. It was a legislative effort, and it was kind of a no holds barred. I mean, if people get mad today about some of the backstories that brands create, they would have been livid with how
back then, yeah.
with how they did things. But fortunately for bourbon, the internet didn't exist. But there was one guy who opposed bourbon becoming a unique product in the United States, and actually there is. In their discussions about it, they called bourbon our native spirit. So they actually did use that term in their discussions. But there was one guy, James Lindsay, who is a congressman out of New York. He protested it and he fought it. He fought it to the point where he was able to table it for a vote, and they weren't able to get it voted on for April 30th. So, and the reason why is because he had connections to a Mexican distillery that was making Mexican bourbon. And that was, he was trying to reserve their ability to continue making Mexican bourbon, which, by the way, is god-awful.
That sounds hot. Mexican and bourbon.
I've had Mexican bourbon, and it was the second worst whiskey I put upon my lips. So...
I'm sure you don't want to talk about the first.
The first one was a corn whiskey out of Tennessee, distilled in like 1909. I actually just tasted it this year. But if you can imagine distilled horse piss, I imagine that's what it tastes like anyway.
Shopify's already taken the cash register online, helping millions sell billions around the world. But did you know that Shopify can do the same thing at your retail store? Give your point-of-sale system a serious upgrade with Shopify. Shopify's point-of-sale is your command center for your retail store. From accepting payments to managing inventory, Shopify has everything you need to sell in person. And with Shopify, you get a powerhouse selling partner that effortlessly unites your in-person and online sales into one source of truth. Track every sale across your business in one place and know exactly what's in stock. Connect with customers in-line and online. Shopify helps you drive store traffic with plug-and-play tools built for marketing campaigns, from TikTok to Instagram and beyond. And get hardware that fits your business. Take payments by smartphone, transform your tablet into a point-of-sale system, or use Shopify's point-of-sale Go mobile device for a battle-tested solution. Plus, Shopify's award-winning 24/7 help is there to support your success every step of the way. Do retail right with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/bourbon, all lowercase, and go to shopify.com/bourbon to take your retail business to the next level today. Shopify.com/bourbon. If you're anything like me, then you can't get enough about bourbon. And that's why I'm a subscriber to Bourbon Plus magazine. Bourbon Plus is a quarterly publication that tells the stories from the heart of bourbon, the farmers who grow the grain, the distillers who labor over the process, and the people like you and me who raise their glasses to celebrate it all. Subscribe to Bourbon Plus magazine today at bourbonplus.com, that's PLUS.com, and use code PURSUIT at checkout for $5 off your subscription.
So I guess we'll want to touch on one more chapter, and I thought it had a very interesting title, and it's called To Beat Jack Daniels.
So Jack Daniels is blowing up. I mean, it is destroying the liquor world, and it's getting placement all over the world. And a guy named Frank Sinatra can't stop singing about it. It ends up on the cover of Guns N' Roses. Jack Daniels is everywhere.
Was Jack Daniels always owned by Brown & Forman, or was it acquired?
Brown Forman acquired him in the 1950s.
1950, okay.
Yeah, so it was a hot little distillery that everybody wanted, and Brown Forman kind of got it out from underneath everybody in the 1950s, and it was going gangbusters. And so everything that people would do was they would try to follow Jack Daniels. And there was one brand in particular that was following Jack Daniels all over the place, and that was Maker's Mark. And it was so bad that
they didn't make like Lynchburg lemonade with Maker's Mark, did they?
Well, they did something worse. They found a guy by the name of Jack Daniel, and they put him in the same garb as Jack Daniels. And they said, wow, look, a guy named Jack Daniel really loves Maker's Mark. And they purchased all these full-page ads everywhere, and it was a national ad campaign. And then Bill Samuels Jr. is throwing a party, and he invites Owsley Brown, who's the head guy at Brown Forman, and he invites him to the party. And he's like, okay, fine, I'm going to go. And he goes to the party. And guess who's playing as the entertainment? The Jack Daniels band. And so, as sources told me, he came back from that. He's like, well, somebody please create a bourbon brand to get Maker's Mark off of Jack Daniels. And that's allegedly how Woodford Reserve was created. It was basically as a competition for Maker's Mark. And the thing is it worked. It worked, and Woodford Reserve is I don't know if you will find a more loyal fan base than than Woodford Reserve.
I'll totally agree.
Yeah, it's a staple in many bars.
Yeah, and I was on an airplane once, and this lady said, this guy sitting next to a lady gets Woodford and Coke, and this woman, I mean, she just really rares up. It's like, you mean to tell me you're going to pour Coca-Cola on the world's best bourbon? I thought she was going to punch the guy.
That's awesome.
Well, I don't have any war stories like that from the air, but I do see every once in a while, because I fly Delta. Delta's got Woodford on there, and every once in a while you see somebody order it, and I'm like, you know what? I'll just take the advice of some of the other past guests and say, just enjoy it how you want to enjoy it, as long as you're drinking it, right?
Well, see, I'm not affiliated with the brand, so I can say whatever I want.
Yeah, there you go.
You know what? There's some brands you don't need to pour with Coke, and I actually think Coca-Cola mixing is reserved for real basic bourbons. I wouldn't. Yeah, actually, Woodford is kind of borderline, but for that one, I wouldn't put it. I would do ice on it. I wouldn't.
Yeah.
Well, good. We'll take your advice on that. And I don't want to really touch on Chapter 12, because Chapter 12, I think you need to read at least the first 11 chapters to understand the title of Chapter 12, which was, it's the potential downfall of the bourbon brand or the bourbon industry at some point. So I don't want to touch on that, but it just gives a little inkling to our readers of things you can expect. And so definitely go out there and buy the book. But another question through all this, and kind of the last question about the book is, what did you learn about the histories of the brands through this process of writing? Like, is a lot of this kind of stuff like you kind of knew before, or is it, you learn more about yourself through this, or just anything like that?
I learned that there's a lot we don't know. And I found some old notes from a previous distiller and talking about things. And he was a second generation original Kentucky distiller. And he was basically reciting everything his dad had said, or his grandpa had said, And it just, in reading through that, it was like, there's so much in bourbon we don't know. And I hope we find out. I hope we find out more distillers, more things that they did in the 1800s and 1900s. But there's enough people looking now that I think we'll have a lot more questions answered in 20 years. But this space has been dominated by the archives of the distillers. And I think that, and what I hope that my book does is kind of like start looking more into the archives of the federal agencies that touched the distilleries, because what I was able to find was pretty cool. And there's been a lot of trade negotiations where bourbon was on the table, and Tennessee whiskey was on the table. Like New Zealand and Australia, the only countries that you can get bourbon bottled at 74 proof, and it was in their trade negotiations. So there's, for people who like history and think that everything's been kind of told already in bourbon, I've got news for you. We're just getting started. I'm just one writer. I think Chuck Cowdery's got another book in him. I think Mike Veach has got another book in him. And I hope Reed Mittenbuehler, with his talent, brings another book to the table. So just keep a space open on your shelf for more bourbon histories, because there's a lot more to be found.
Volume 2, right?
Or on your Kindle.
Or on your Kindle, there you go.
Actually, Kindles are pretty amazing, because you can highlight and you can search.
I'm a big Kindle fan.
So I know I'm going to probably open up a can of worms here and dive into a rabbit hole, but I think it's while we got you here, it's a good time to ask this, because there was a pretty good discussion that was happening last week on one of the forums, and everybody, you ask one question and everybody's got an opinion. So everybody, of course, always asked, and you were in there and you were talking about it. But the argument was that, and by the way, we're all over the book now, so we're just talking about whiskey in general here. But it was a question that said, is a bourbon that's actually finished in a barrel, can it still be considered a bourbon at this point, or should they start creating a new category?
I would like them to see a new category. I love the flavors. First of all, I love the flavors that come from these barrel finishes. I love them. They bring a new element to it.
We're drinking one of those right now.
Yeah, the Joseph Magnus. And the thing is, as someone who studied bourbon from a historical standpoint, and I understand consumer trends, if you don't present something new like this, you're going to lose like a good chunk of consumers. And so I would like to see a new category. As it is now, these saying it's finished and X cask, I don't know. I was really against that in the beginning. I really, really was. I was very anti.
Trying to keep it pure or whatever.
Yeah, but as I tasted more of them and I saw more come out on the market, my mind started to change. It was really Maker's 46 that opened my eyes. Got me a little bit more onto the barrel finish side, because this is what winemakers do. Winemakers are able to do this. They're able to add staves and various things. And there were people adding barrel chips in the 1800s. So this stuff existed before us, but there wasn't really legislation or anything like that holding it. It was just kind of a free-for-all out there. Remember, there weren't definitions until, the Taft decision in 1910. So you have a lot of this stuff has been done before. But I think the question that we have to ask is, does it taste good? And can we create a new definition? I mean, I would love to see it. I would love to see a new definition. But if you think this is bad, take a look at rum. You have fake rum everywhere. You have a sugar beet rum, you have a sorghum molasses rum, and the definition on the U.S., UN, and every other major global entity says that rum has to come from sugarcane. This is so minor. This is such a minor detail in the grand scheme of spirits in terms of definition and debates, that in the larger purview, it doesn't bother me right now. What I am noticing that is kind of getting troubling is you're seeing a little bit more go into this whole bottle to taste, like so dropping the age statements. That sort of thing is very concerning for me, because I think that if you don't have an age range, then how are we as consumers able to taste and compare and contrast? I have more concerns about the dropping of age statements and flavored whiskeys. I look at the barrel finish category as very positive. Does there need to be a category? Absolutely, but we also need people putting the state of distillation on their bottles. So it's very low on the list of things that piss me off.
So, like with regards to the age statement, I guess distillers are saying we're dropping it because we want to make it available. Would you rather be like Weller 12? We can barely even get anymore, or have Elijah Craig available.
Well, keep in mind a lot of it is a matter of what they choose to tell you, and it's also a matter of what they choose to tell me, or they're even their own employees. There are the obvious answer to all this is they would like the profits. And they look at this not as like they do in wine with vintages. They look at these as brands versus, it's about branding that individual brand. It's not about making sure that they have enough for it to get out there. It's about making sure that they have, they have more penetration with that particular brand, and thus more cases in the market, and thus more profits backline. It's worth pointing out a company like Heaven Hill, Bourbon's it's not their major moneymaker anymore. So the decisions they're making are not as powerful on their bottom line as it would have been, say, 1979 or 1982. But it's disheartening to me, because I kind of feel like a lot of the whiskey geeks were just kind of getting tossed off to the side. But on the same token, there are people who see that, and that's what's giving us something like, Joseph Magnus or Bellamy. Now, these are two source whiskeys, but the way that they choose to do their styles, to me, with their barrel finishes, are very exciting. And so there are people who are willing to say, all right, we're going to put an age statement on here, and we're going to stick to it. We'll handwrite it. Barrel Bourbon, handwrites it. So you have a lot of people who are picking up, that age statement slack. And so that is actually, positive. If bourbon is to take that next step, we need smaller distilleries to really make a bang. We need MB Rollin and New Riff and Rabbit Hole and Finger Lakes Distilling and, Kings County.
But can they compete against, these big existing brands?
They cannot compete on a volume level. There's no way they can compete on a volume level, but they can compete on a quality basis. When I tasted the Kings County peated bourbon, I was blown away. I thought I was going to hate it. I was like, oh, this is stupid. Peated bourbon.
So you didn't have a confirmation bias?
No. Well, that's what I had going into it. And then I tasted it, and I was like, damn, they did something really exceptional here. And so, the distillers, we're going to find out if age statements matter. They matter to me. They matter to you. I'm still going to buy Elijah Craig, but they matter to the whiskey geeks. The question is, does it matter to the new 25-year-old consumer who just read about bourbon and just walks into a store? Because that's who they're trying to capture. Is that if they don't capture the 25 to 35-year-old age group who's just getting into bourbon or getting into spirits, then they're done in 20 years. Like if you don't capture that group now, then you're done. And that's based on brand. It's not based on genre. They're moving away from, the pie is really big now. So now I think they're going more for that. They're fighting more for that space on the shelf. And you can tell by listening to the master distillers. The master distillers don't talk about the category overall as much as they used to. Now they're talking about within, they'll talk about the category overall, but they'll get very specific about their brand after about 2 or 3 paragraphs. And they're on point with communications. And that's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with that. That's their directive from their bosses, and that's what they want to do, and that's where they're going with stuff. And the quality, the thing is, if the quality's still there, then I'll eat some crow. But I think that you need age statements in order to protect the quality. I would rather see the price go up, but
I think it could be part of a longer roadmap discussion too when you talk to some of these people, because if you're able to do a land grab now and get as many shareholders or get as many people buying your product now, the thirst for knowledge is always going to come later. As we can see by talking and looking at all these people and these Facebook groups. I mean, there was a local group. It's okay. There was a local group that went from just a handful of people to now reaching over 600. And it just goes to show you that the thirst for knowledge is there. And once they start learning about things like Pappy Van Winkle and, bourbons that are aged 20 years or more, or even 10 years or more, they're going to want to get to there. So perhaps it's like I said, it's a land grab thing. And it's as consumers get smarter and as they want to start getting more of this stuff, then, I mean, as we could see, even this year, Parker's 24 year came out and they just had a 24-year-old bourbon laying around, right? That's just going to go to show you that I think as the time's going to progress, they're going to bring out more of these age-stated bourbons that maybe people that are consuming more, want to learn more, are going to start trying to get.
He's been talking to someone. That's a pretty good answer, actually. I will say that if that's where we're going to go, just make sure it's good. What Julian Van Winkle did with Pappy Van Winkle with the 23-year-old, in my opinion, is the exception when it comes to older bourbons. There is often too much wood north of 18 years old. Even a lot of 18-year-olds will have a lot of wood to them. And if we're talking about is like preserving the age statements past 18, I have real fears for the bourbon industry, because there was a time when 8-year-old bourbon meant something to people. And if you saw 8-year-old bourbon in the liquor store, you're like, oh, this is quality. 8-year-old, that's it. But now, they seem to think it's okay to drop it off. And I don't care what they say. They may say it's 8 to 12 years old in the bottle, or they can say it is, 6 to 15 years old in the bottle. If you do not put an age statement on there, there is an assumption by a certain percentage of us that think it's just 4 years old. And that's because that's what the regulation allows. And it's something that I think could lose a lot of the hardcore bourbon consumers is the age statements, because if you take a look at the last 5 years, we've seen the prices go up. We can't get the products we want anymore. The age statements are dropping. They're putting out more flavored whiskey. What about the guy who brought you to the dance? And that's just it. It's like they don't care about the guy who's coming in from North Dakota anymore every single year to the Kentucky Bourbon Festival and loads up his car with everything that he can get his hands on here in Kentucky and then goes back. They seem to... That guy wants age statements, or he wants some kind of guarantee that his whiskey is of a certain age. With a brand like Maker's Mark, who has always been, quote, to taste, I have a little bit more respect for them, because they have always thought that about age statements. They've never had any of this indication that age even mattered. They're always about taste. That's what they say. Now, have they lowered their projections of what they put in there? I don't know. I'm not inside there. But I respect the brands who didn't have an age statement in 1985. And I have extreme disappointment in the brands that had an age statement between 1985 and 2006. And suddenly the age statements are gone because and they no longer matter. If you read their comments, the age doesn't matter. it's about the taste, or it's we're trying to preserve the brand and or like put it back on you and the consumer, say like, well, we want to make sure you have it, so we have to do this. And so, I think that's a little unjust from to the guy who's been drinking 8-year-old Jim Beam Black for forever. And that was the one where it really hurt for me, was Jim Beam Black. Jim Beam Black was the one where really, that one more than any of them pissed me off.
Why that one in particular?
I think it's because that was my mixing bourbon at the house. That was the bourbon when I'm on the road. That's what I get my Bloody Marys with. And now I can't even touch it. I mean, like, I have like such like emotional ties to Jim Beam Black. It was like, it just pissed me off. And then it was like, Knob Creek was then. I was like, all right, well, Knob Creek's where I'm going now. And so Knob Creek, I kind of developed this amazing relationship with, and I feel like I had a little bit to do with it getting the world's best bourbon in San Francisco, because that was the one where I tasted and I was like, this is the one, and I was like, this is the best one here. And for that tasting, it absolutely was. There was not a better bourbon at that tasting, and to this day, I'm still amazed that Knob Creek won that one. But at any rate, it was that was my bourbon. That was like my bourbon, because I had the 9-year-old guarantee, and now that's gone.
Now that's gone.
So,
do you think you have an Oprah effect on bourbon? Like you say, when you taste something and give it a high rating.
There have been going back to my tasting panel days. The first one was Weller. The next one was Jim Beam, and then Knob Creek. I don't think I'm that. No, I don't think I have an Oprah effect. But I think that collectively we all kind of taste the same thing, and we're not all that far apart from what we all like. If you take a look at the broader, like more the general like whiskey geeks, when we're all tasting something, we get really excited about it. We all tend to fall in line really with the same stuff, and we all dislike the same stuff. There's a margin of error, obviously, but one of them was being the Knob Creek that they released. Was it 2001? What was that?
Knob Creek 2001. It was this year.
Yeah. That was just. I think I scored that an 82 for a Whiskey Advocate, which is not a bad score. But I also scored Heaven Hill 6-year-old like an 83. So if you're willing to pay $150 for
versus $9,
for an 80, for that particular product, then knock yourself out. But there's a lot of issues coming at bourbon, and I'm so concerned about more effort into designing packages and less effort with what's inside the bottle.
Well, I think we're going to have you on again, and it's just going to be called an episode of what grinds Fred's
bourbon
gears.
Issues.
Yeah, the Family Guy thing, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's actually easier to just talk about it than to write about it, because when you write about it, it's like you have to count on somebody reading it.
Yeah.
And then you get into another topic, like, oh, didn't you read that? Like, no. I'm saying, oh, well, let me repeat myself.
Right.
So actually, just shooting the shit can be a little easier sometimes.
Absolutely. So we've gone way over our usual mark, but this is fantastic. I think we've gotten a lot of good information out of this. So if you want to find all of Fred's books, including Bourbon Curious, Whiskey Women, and his latest book, Bourbon: The Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of American Whiskey, you can find all of them on Amazon. You can also find the links on his website at fredminnick.com. For anybody that wants to learn more about what you're doing or how to get in touch with you personally, your email list, how do they do all that?
I guess just go to my website, fredminnick.com. I'm also very active on Twitter. Like if at any point in the day, if I'm on Twitter and you say something to me, even if it's like you fucking suck, I'll do my best to respond. But I love Twitter. Twitter to me is like, somebody asked me like 10 years or whenever Twitter and Facebook were rivals, they're like, which one's going to last? I'm like, well, I think it'll be Twitter, because that seems to be like the news side of things. and Facebook is where people go to bitch and show cats.
So babies and their entrees.
Well, now Instagram's taking
That's
care
true,
of that,
sure.
but
Well, until we can bid on mega balls on on
Yeah.
Instagram, I don't know, right?
Exactly. No raffles on there.
Yeah.
but yeah, anywhere, just website, Twitter, whatever.
Awesome. So make sure you follow Fred. It's at Fred Minnick on Twitter. Make sure you follow us at Bourbon Pursuit on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Also support the show if you like what you hear on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Bourbon Pursuit.
Thanks, Fred, again. Glad we could hit record this time, and appreciate you sharing some of your collection with us.
Well, we're not done here yet, so
That's true. We got a few more we need to open up.
Yeah.
So
We're gonna.
Well, it's a pleasure to get on. I really mean that. What you guys have done in the bourbon area of podcasting is nothing short of amazing. Because this seems like a lot of work. So good for you guys for doing
It's
it.
real tough. We come in, we show up, you put 6 bottles, we drink them, and we talk. That's what we do.
Yeah, there's worse things out there.
Yeah.
But again, thank you for being on the show, and we will see you all next week.
Cheers.
Cheers.